"Tell me what you think of it," said the man in the corner, seeing that Polly remained silent and puzzled. "Well," she replied dubiously, "I suppose that the so-called Armand de la Tremouille story was true in substance. That he did not perish on the Argentina, but drifted home, and blackmailed his former wife. Doesn't it strike you that there are at least two very strong points against that theory?" he asked, making two gigantic knots in his piece of string. "Two?" "Yes. In the first place, if the blackmailer was the Comte de la Tremouille returned to life, why should he have been content to take £10,000 from a lady who was his lawful wife, and who could keep him in luxury for the rest of his natural life upon her large fortune, which was close upon £250,000? The real Comte de la Tremouille, remember, had never found it difficult to get money out of his wife during their brief married life, whatever Mr. Morton's subsequent experience in the same direction might have been. And, secondly, why should he have typewritten his letters to his wife? Because that was a point which, to my mind, the police never made the most of. Now, my experience in criminal cases has invariably been that when a typewritten letter figures in one, that letter is a forgery. It is not very difficult to imitate a signature, but it is a jolly sight more difficult to imitate a handwriting throughout an entire letter. Then, do you think? I think, if you will allow me, he interrupted excitedly, that we will go through the points, the sensible, tangible points of the case. Firstly, Mr. Morton disappears with £10,000 in his pocket for 4 entire days. At the end of that time he is discovered loosely tied to an armchair, and a wool shawl round his mouth. Secondly, a man named Skinner is accused of the outrage. Mr. Morton, although he himself is able, mind you, to furnish the best defense possible for Skinner, by denying his identity with the man who assaulted him, refuses to prosecute. Why? He did not wish to drag his wife's name into the case. He must have known that the Crown would take up the case. Then, again, how is it no one saw him in the company of the swarthy foreigner he described? 2 witnesses did see Mr. Morton in company with Skinner, argued Polly. Yes, at 9.20 in West Street. That would give Edward Skinner time to catch the 9.45 at the station, and to entrust Mr. Morton with the latchkey of Russell House, remarked the man in the corner dryly. What nonsense! Polly ejaculated. Nonsense, is it? He said, tugging wildly at his bit of string. Is it nonsense to affirm that if a man wants to make sure that his victim shall not escape, he does not usually wind rope loosely round his figure, nor does he throw a wool shawl lightly round his mouth? The police were idiotic beyond words. They themselves discovered that Morton was so loosely fastened to his chair that very little movement would have disentangled him, and yet it never struck them that nothing was easier for that particular type of scoundrel to sit down in an armchair and wind a few yards of rope round himself, than, having wrapped a wool shawl round his throat, to slip his 2 arms inside the ropes. But what object would a man in Mr. Morton's position have for playing such extraordinary pranks? Ah, the motive. There you are. What do I always tell you? Seek the motive. Now, what was Mr. Morton's position? He was the husband of a lady who owned £250,000 of money, not 1 penny of which he could touch without her consent, as it was settled on herself, and who, after the terrible way in which she had been plundered and then abandoned in her early youth, no doubt kept a very tight hold upon the purse strings. Mr. Morton's subsequent life has proved that he had certain expensive, not altogether avowable, tastes. One day he discovers the old love letters of the Comte Armand de la Tremouille. Then he lays his plans. He typewrites a letter, forges the signature of the erstwhile Count, and awaits events. The fish does rise to the bait. He gets sundry bits of money, and his success makes him daring. He looks round him for an accomplice, clever, unscrupulous, greedy, and selects Mr. Edward Skinner, probably some former pal of his Wild Oats days. The plan was very neat, you must confess. Mr. Skinner takes the room in Russell House, and studies all the manners and customs of his landlady and her servant. He then draws the full attention of the police upon himself. He meets Morton in West Street, then disappears ostensibly after the assault. In the meanwhile, Morton goes to Russell House. He walks upstairs, talks loudly in the room, then makes elaborate preparations for his comedy. Why? He nearly died of starvation. That, I dare say, was not a part of his reckoning. He thought, no doubt, that Mrs. Chapman or the servant would discover and rescue him pretty soon. He meant to appear just a little faint, and endured quietly the first 24 hours of inanition. But the excitement and want of food told on him more than he expected. After 24 hours he turned very giddy and sick, and, falling from one fainting fit into another, was unable to give the alarm. However, he is all right again now, and concludes his part of a downright blackguard to perfection. Under the plea that his conscience does not allow him to live with a lady whose first husband is still alive, he has taken a bachelor flat in London, and only pays afternoon calls on his wife in Brighton. But presently he will tire of his bachelor life, and will return to his wife. And I'll guarantee that the Comte de la Tremouille will never be heard of again. And that afternoon the man in the corner left Miss Polly Burton alone with a couple of photos of two uninteresting, stodgy, quiet-looking men, Morton and Skinner, who, if the old scarecrow was right in his theories, were a pair of the finest blackguards unhung.